Today we're going to talk about podcast advertising, but before diving into the nitty-gritty of this initiative, we'll talk a little bit about the history of podcasts in general. Then we'll dive into the implementation, commitment and fees, prospecting, what it's like to actually secure sponsorship, and then I'll show some sponsorship examples. So let's start with the history. Where does podcast, the word, has actually come from? So in 2004, a writer, Ben Hammersley, he wrote in The Guardian about the Audible revolution. He didn't really know what to call podcasts at the time, so he referred to it as audio blogging, guerrilla marketing, and podcasts. A year later, that was a really big year for podcasts in general, Apple announced that it was taking podcasts mainstream. So what this means is that iTunes users were now able to have everything they needed to discover, subscribe, manage, and listen to podcasts. At the time, there were about 3,000 podcasts available on iTunes, so this was a pretty big deal, and all those episodes were automatically downloaded to people's iPods. In 2005, the word podcast was also officially added to the Oxford Dictionary. Interestingly enough, the runner-up was bird flu. Right, so since Apple took podcasting mainstream, as you can see here, the trend for podcasting has continued to go up. And this is the trend that you're looking at for worldwide, but the US in general looks rather similar to this. So let's talk about actually podcast advertising. What do we want to know about it? What do we want to tell our clients about it? Well, first, podcast advertising is a paid sponsorship opportunity that allows us to grow brand awareness. So unlike a traditional paid medium, podcasts allow us to get to users in places where usually they would block ads. So research has shown that people that subscribe to ad-free services, so like ad-free Hulu, ad-free Spotify, those people are also the people that are listening to podcasts. So this is just a nice way of getting to them when they're not really expecting to hear an ad. The other thing is it allows us to get in front of a very hyper-targeted and engaged audience. So what I mean by engaged audience is that those listeners are really tuning in to the messages that they're hearing in their headphones. Think about the last time you were on an airplane. You're watching a movie, you got really maybe emotional because there was a really sad scene. And the reason for that isn't just because there's the altitude, you're exhausted, there's jet lag. It really has to do with the fact that you're so tuned in to the message that you're seeing, hearing, and engaging with. So how does it work? Well, podcasts, as mentioned before, allow us to get a wide distribution. So they're not just visible, you don't just get the visibility across iTunes anymore, right? You have Spotify, you have Stitcher, SoundCloud, Overcast, all those channels. Not to mention the one-off mentions that podcast hosts do to promote themselves on their own channels. So that would be Facebook, Twitter, any of their social presence in general. Some of them even have newsletters. The other thing is evergreen exposure. So downloads are trickling in months after months. So just because you paid for the sponsorship 2 months ago doesn't mean that sponsorship ends. Those downloads will continue trickling in and people will continue learning about your product months after they've initially heard about it. And then referral traffic. Referral traffic comes in one of two ways. So first we have the on-air ad reads, which is the dedicated landing page that you are promoting, and the listener will then type in that landing page and get to your product or service that way. And the other way, they'll interact with it within the show notes mentioned. So some of the podcasts will actually have a little blurb that they'll write about their sponsor, and then they can link to the sponsor from there. There are 3 different types of ad they need to be aware of. So there's the pre-roll, which runs at the start of the episode. Those tend to be a little bit cheaper in comparison to the other ones because people can skip through the pre-roll ads a lot easier. Then we have the mid-roll that naturally runs in the middle of the episode, and those are a little bit more challenging to skip through. Think about it as a listener, you're probably out doing something, maybe you're sitting on the bus, your phone is in your bag. It's a lot harder for you to get to your device and actually skip through that episode. And then we also have the post-roll, which runs at the very end. Similar to the pre-roll, it tends to be a little bit cheaper because it runs right at the end of the episode, but before the final credits. So users can very easily just exit out of the episode before that happens. So for this reason, we definitely are targeting podcasts that do use the mid-roll ad and allow people to be have the most exposure of your brand or product. And there are two different types of ad reads. There's the baked-in ads and dynamically inserted ads. So baked-in ads are the ads that are the evergreen ads. They will continue to be part of the podcast for the entire longevity of that episode until the host actually decides to remove the episode entirely. Where the dynamically inserted ads are the type of ads that usually bigger podcasts tend to use. So they will take them in and out of episodes, and they'll run like monthly campaigns or quarterly campaigns. And then once that campaign is done running, they'll take it out and replace it with another sponsor, which obviously is not as beneficial because you're only paying for that amount of time of the ad read. So for that reason, again, we want to go after baked in, a lot more brand awareness and a lot more exposure over time. What are our KPIs? Like, what should we be really tracking? How are we measuring the success of this initiative? So we're doing this in a couple different ways. The downloads per episode, this is something that should be available to every single podcast host out there. So that's the number of downloads each episode receives. Then there's the direct and referral traffic. So the direct traffic is a person typing in that landing page that you had created for them to visit. And then there's referral traffic, which will come in from the website of that podcast. And then, of course, there's offer signups. One really simple way of doing this is offering your listeners a promo code. That way you can track the number of subscribers or people that are entered a discount code and see how many people are actually taking advantage of the offer that you had provided to them. And then the last thing is user engagement. This is a very interesting metric. We've done this for one of our clients where we weren't really offering a product. We were more so offering our website as a resource, our client's website as a resource. So we wanted to send them there. We wanted them to interact with the content. Those are the KPIs that we were measuring there. So looking at those metrics and being able to understand how much time they're spending when they're there. Are they engaging with it overall? Are they clicking through other pages? Are they bouncing? Those are the types of things that we would want to measure. Let's talk about implementation. What does it actually take to get this initiative rolled out? Well, podcast advertising requires a lot of upfront work, and that's because there's just a lot of little tasks that you need to be aware of before you get organized. But once the initial process is built out, it becomes rather repetitive and very simple. I've broken this down into a 3-part process. The first one starts with prospecting. When I say prospecting, I mean how do we identify a really good fit for a podcast and our clients or our audience? The next thing is figuring out budget. When you're doing the prospecting, you'll get to understand what the costs are associated within the niche that you're interested in targeting in. And then from then, you can build a budget and realistically thinking, okay, what is the highest end and the lowest end that you're willing to spend within this niche? Then you're going to want to think about your talking points and your product offer. So the talking points is the message that the host is going to read on air. You want that to be rather natural, so you don't want to build out an entire script, but more of like a bulleted list format of just key things that you want your listeners, the podcast listeners, to hear. And I'll have an example of that a little bit later. And then, of course, the offer. Now, the offer should definitely be a lot more unique to any other offer that you have available on the website. So, for example, if you already offer a 14-day free trial of your product or service, you don't want the listeners to offer the same offer in this initiative because then it just won't seem very unique. So you definitely want to make sure that the offer is longer, or the offer allows users to really feel that this was designed with them in mind. Next, you're going to want to think about wireframing a landing page. So this is the page that they'll see when they first go to your website. We definitely recommend making this customized to individual podcasts, and also making those pages no index, no follow. So meaning that nobody else can find these in search, and Google doesn't index them on in their search results. So you have a lot of freedom here to really get creative and make them personalized. And then that's also the place where people will actually redeem their offer code. The part 2 requires securing dates. So once the entirety of part 1 is complete, you want to follow up with the host that you've decided to work with, and then secure sponsorship dates with them. Usually they'll give you a range of dates that they have open, and now's the time to really figure out when the first ad read can go out and how long your relationship will last with them. Then you're also going to want to put the welcome landing page in the dev queue. Going to want to get that done, give it enough time to test, that sort of thing. You want to organize your sponsorship calendar. There's going to be a lot, especially if you're doing this for the first time and you want to test a couple different podcasts. You want to stay as organized as possible, and then on the date of when the episode is supposed to air, you're going to want to visit that podcast and make sure everything went smoothly. They didn't forget about you. They mentioned you properly in the show notes. So that's very important to keep organized. And then, of course, set up tracking and or retargeting. So when I say tracking, that's making sure ideally you're using Google Analytics, and you're going to want to set up filters in there that will put all the podcasts in one bucket, so then you can easily visit Google Analytics and see how your podcasts are performing comparatively to your other channels. And then retargeting is something you can do if you're doing this on a really big level and you're also using social. You can put people that are visiting those pages into a retargeting pool, and then show them ads at a later point. Right. And for part 3, you're going to want to finalize dates and payments, make sure you're all set there. Then you're going to want to monitor incoming sponsorship mentions once everything starts going live. And then lastly, you're going to want to track and report on your KPIs. Commitment and fees. You should really, as mentioned before, once you're working and trying to figure out which niche you're going to be targeting, each one of them is going to have different commitment and fees. But there's definitely the higher end and lower end of where you should expect things to lie. So from what we've seen on the higher end, podcast advertisements tend to be more expensive. The rates are fixed, so you don't really get to negotiate if you can get a bundle of episodes for a certain amount. They just have that all figured out because there's very high demand for those podcasts. They usually require longer commitment, so anywhere from 3 to 5 to 10 episodes. It really depends podcast by podcast. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. Best practices show that the more you sponsor podcasts, so the ideal window is between 3 to 5 episodes is when people really start to engage and are more interested in looking at your website and entering that promo code. There's a longer waiting period. There's podcasts that we worked with that are booked out 6 months to a year in advance. And so you really need to be proactive if you're trying to work with some of the bigger names in the industry. And they also require, another great part about bigger podcasts is that they have greater reach. So your audience is much bigger, and overall, more people will hear your ad or get to know your product. And then on the lower end, they tend to be less expensive. Anywhere from $500 is a really good place to start. The fees are negotiable. You can do like package deals and get extra episodes or lowering rate by like 20%. All those things are definitely not off the table, and you should definitely talk to the host to see how they can accommodate you if you're planning on sponsoring them for a long time. They require shorter commitments, so you can do anywhere from 1 episode to 3. Again, that's not going to be the most effective way of doing it, but you can, if you're just really nervous about it or just want to try an episode or 2 just to see what it's going to sound and feel like, you can do that with smaller podcasts. There's a lot faster turnaround time, meaning that you can really start working with a podcast anywhere within like 2 to 3 weeks. You don't have to wait 6 months to a year. That's a really great addition. But they also have smaller reach. So smaller reach, meaning they have less downloads per episode. So less people will hear about the sponsorship overall. However, that's not really necessarily the worst case scenario, because people are just getting, especially if you have a very niche market, it's going to be good for those people to hear your brand and offer, and then have a greater potential of them to actually try your product if it's very much catered to that audience. Okay, let's talk about prospecting. Where do you start? So identifying a niche isn't really as difficult as it sounds, because there is a podcast niche in almost any category you can possibly think of. So we have music, comedy, health, technology, gaming, anything you can think of, I'm sure there's a podcast out there. Our process is to start figuring out what niche you do want to start working with. Then you're going to want to research and really understand the podcasts that are within that niche. Next, you're going to want to track down their past sponsors, so who else has sponsored that podcast that you are interested in. And then you're going to run a backlink analysis on them to figure out who else has sponsored them. So next, I'm going to walk through this entire process to kind of make it a lot more clearer. So when I say identify target niche, I literally mean typing into Google something like science podcast. This is something that we had to do for one of our clients that was in the documentary streaming service realm. And science is a big audience for them. They really wanted to get in with these folks. So we didn't really know much about science podcasts out there. So we just typed in, science podcasts, and then you come by a roundup that will say just a bunch of podcasts listed together. So that's exactly what we did here. We looked at the 20 best science podcasts and kind of went through the list. This podcast stood out to me, Stuff You Should Know. It's pretty cool. It's just talks about a bunch of really interesting things, some related to science, some not. But what we did next is took a look and see who else sponsors them. So you can do this in one of 2 ways. The first way is looking at individual show notes mentioned. So that's what I mentioned a while back. That means the podcast will actually show in their show notes who their past sponsors were. Another way of doing this, and this is something that the Stuff You Should Know podcast had, is that they had a dedicated advertising landing page which listed all their past sponsors. Now this is great because from here you can see all other brands that had advertised on this podcast and found this podcast to be a good audience fit for them. Now going back to our client, which was in the documentary streaming space, Audible is relatively similar to them, right? Much more similar than, for example, Casper mattress brand or Blue Apron. So we really honed in on that and wanted to do a backlink analysis on them to see who else Audible had sponsored in the past in addition to Stuff You Should Know. To do that, we use a tool called Ahrefs. This is a really powerful tool for outreach, for content strategy. I use it day in and day out. And it's very simple to use. You can just type in the URL and it'll give you a number of backlinks that are available for Audible. And then from there you can sort through and then figure out who else have they sponsored. Now I know what you're thinking. You're asking me to filter through 18 million backlinks. That is a lot of links. I know it sounds scary, but I promise you it's a lot less painful than it sounds. So let's talk about backlink analysis. How do you actually go about doing this? Well, first you start by downloading a massive sheet from Ahrefs with all the links, in this case, linking back to Audible. Then you exclude all links that are nofollow. So what we mean by that is that those are usually a lot of random websites that will link to you, but they're not necessarily meaning to link to you. So you just want to exclude all nofollow links. Usually they're lower quality. The next thing you're going to want to do is remove sites that have a domain authority below 30. Domain authority is a ranking that's given to you by search engines to figure out like how good of a website you have. So below 30 is just kind of like an average that I've seen with podcasts. Anything below that tends to be on a less built out way. So podcasts may not be as established in that space. Then you're going to want to filter by surrounding text. There's a really cool feature in Ahrefs that allows you to literally filter by links that are surrounding specific text. In this case, we're looking for sponsorships, so we want to type in things like sponsor, podcast, today's episode, and then look at links that you pull from that filter. Once you filter through that, you're going to want to group similar links. So if you are Audible, chances are you didn't just sponsor one episode of Stuff You Should Know podcast. You probably did multiple. So this is just a nice way to clean up your spreadsheet further by grouping those links and making it smaller. Once you filtered the backlinks, next you're going to want to filter the actual podcast. So these are some of the best practices that we've been using. I've seen them to be successful. First, you're going to want to avoid any major platforms like Libsyn and Podbean. So think of those similar to Blogspot. It's just anyone can throw in a website on there and it's just not as good of quality. So you're going to want to avoid those. Then you want to exclude podcasts without show notes. If they don't have show notes, you're not going to be able to get that referral traffic from the podcasts, so we would just want to exclude them as well. And then you're going to want to focus on podcasts that have their own websites. There are a lot of different platforms that have multiple podcasts on them, but really working with individual podcasts has been working a lot better for us, and they tend to be much cheaper than, for example, working with big platforms like Gimlet Media or NPR. And then the last thing you want to keep in mind is keep podcasts that publish regularly. So you could find sponsors that Audible had sponsored years ago, but now that podcast is no longer live, or they don't have as a consistent of a publishing schedule, so you would want to avoid those just to get things going faster for yourself. Wow, that is a lot of information. Next, you're probably thinking, like, how do I organize it all? Well, we've been using a tracking spreadsheet for that. So this spreadsheet is rather simple. It's just built in Google Sheets, and it's organized by the category of the podcast. Those are the categories we talked about earlier, so music, health, science, that sort of thing. Then we're going to want to include the podcast's name, a little blurb about the show. You're going to be looking at a lot of them, so you want to keep a little tab of what the show is actually about. The name isn't always a dead giveaway. Then you're going to want to include the URL, domain authority, if that's something you're interested in looking at, average number of downloads that podcast receives, the CPM, which is a model on which podcasts are charging their sponsors by. So what this means is that it's a cost per 1,000. So if a podcast has 10,000 downloads and the CPM is 25, a cost of an episode is going to be around $250. But these are all just things to keep in mind as you're filtering through different podcast opportunities. And then you also want to keep in mind how much it costs for mid-roll specifically, since that has the most visibility, but is usually more expensive. So making sure you're getting that information. And then the other couple things, I like to do an average of how much it costs to do about 4 episodes. That just the average that we've been working with, and want to make sure that we have enough budget to sponsor different podcasts and give enough budget to each one. And then the last thing is example of show notes mentioned. So if you're trying to pick between podcasts that are similar, but one does have a little write-up of your business or your the offer, and one does not, this is a really easy way for you to filter that further. Okay, so one quick note about the tracking spreadsheet, and I'm gonna go back to the prior slide really quickly. There's 2 different sheets, and you probably can't read that, but don't worry about it. The first sheet is the one that has all this information on it. And then the second sheet is where you're going to actually keep track of the sponsors whose backlinks you filtered through. So for example, if you've filtered through Audible and you pass this project on to another colleague, or you're looking to do this at a later date, you want to make sure that you don't recreate the wheel every time and filter through the same types of sponsors. So just wanted to keep a sheet dedicated to vetted sponsors. All right, and that is the information that is here. Okay, so when it comes down to gathering all this information that we just talked about in the spreadsheet, there's a couple ways you can do that. Most podcasts list that on their websites nowadays, just because they get these questions constantly. It's a lot easier to just have a dedicated landing page that says all this information for people that want to sponsor them. But in the event that that is not the case, you can reach out to them and just say, hey, I'm reaching out because of a sponsorship inquiry, and I need to know your number of downloads, minimum episodes required to work with you, cost of mid-rolled out ad placement, and the CPM. So you just want, in sending this, they'll usually come back to you in within a couple of days. If they don't come back to you that quickly, it's probably not a good fit. They might be really busy and might not be a good relationship overall. But yeah, this is a really quick and easy way to gather this information. Securing sponsorship placements. Now you've narrowed down your list, you know exactly who you want to work with, you have the budget approved. The next step is to secure the spots. So this, again, it requires a very simple email, reaching out to the host and saying, hey, I'm interested in promoting your podcast. When are your next available dates? And then you're going to want to talk a little bit about yourself or the client that you're pitching on behalf of. So then the podcast host can identify whether or not this is a good fit for them as well. Then the talking points come in. So this is something we mentioned earlier in the slide deck as well. This is kind of an example of what you could send to the host. This is something that we did for one of the documentary streaming provider, Magellan TV. And we had, in this instance, sponsored Astronomy Cast. Magellan TV also, like I said, does they have a science niche, they have a space niche, history, a bunch of different topics. So for this one specifically, we sponsored Astronomy Cast, and we really geared our talking points towards the astronomy genre and towards the people that would be listening to this podcast. And then at the end here, I included a little bit of copy that they could use if they were to include us in the show notes. And this is an example of a welcome landing page that we built out for them. Science podcast is another one that we had done for them, and this is kind of an overview of what people saw once they typed in the prompted URL. In our case, the prompted URL was go to magellantv.com/science magazine. And this is the landing page that they encountered. As you can see, the call to action, which is claiming their 2-month free trial, is above the fold, nice and visible. Then we have a few key differentiators for Magellan TV. And then the next thing you see is an opportunity for the listener to explore their science genre further and to learn more about Magellan content. And then the sponsorship calendar. So this is how we've been organizing our podcast initiative. So here you can place the names of the podcasts that you're working with and then separate it out by different quarters and then put dates within each slot so you can see when they're actually airing and be able to keep track of it this way. And finally, I'll show you guys what the sponsorship examples ended up looking like. So this is what the actual page looked like on Astronomy Cast. They had a little blurb about the episode, and down here at the bottom you see the episode is sponsored by Magellan TV. Very simple, but it has a link that allows us to, we can link to that welcome page and then listeners can find us this way. This is another example, but from True Crime Fan Club, another sponsorship we did for Magellan, and this is more in the conspiracy niche. But in here, the host actually included the whole blurb that we asked them to. So it says, Magellan TV, a brand new streaming service that features the very best collection of documentaries. And then it links out also to the crime and mystery genre so people can interact with that and visit that before they actually sign up. And then lastly, we have a mention of the URL where they can redeem the offer. All right, and that concludes today's talk. Just to recap, we talked a little bit about the history of podcasts, how they've come to be, talked about podcast advertising and what it really means, what are the opportunities, why is it worth getting into this initiative to begin with. Then we discussed implementation, commitment and fees, how to prospect and find podcasts that are fit for your ideal audience, how to secure sponsorship placements, and lastly, a few of our sponsorship results. Thank you.